Test 2, Part 2, Passage 2. Listen to part of a lecture in a botany class.
Okay, for flowers to propagate, they need a pollinator, a means by which pollen from one flower can be carried off and transferred to another flower. Pollen is that fine-grained powder that causes an allergic reaction, usually hay fever in some people. Well, pollen fertilizes plants, which is why flowers need a pollinator. Now, there is no lack of available pollinators. Wind, insects, birds, bats, water, and even human beings can be pollinators. But some flowers need a specific type of pollinator. They have an objective, and they make sure this objective is met by attracting their preferred pollinators in a certain way. Well, this is what we'll be discussing today. So, bees are probably the most recognized of all pollinators. And they make ideal pollinators because they're fuzzy, and they have this electric charge that attracts pollen to their bodies. Some even have a sort of basket, a structure on their lower abdomen that's capable of carrying pollen. But insects such as bees don't go around carrying pollen simply because they want to or because they're being altruistic. Insects approach certain flowers because there's something about these flowers that they find attractive. Aside from providing shelter, flowers use color, shape, and scent to attract pollinators. Bees can't see the color red, but they do see yellow, blue, and violet. And these are the colors that bees are attracted to. Red, on the other hand, is attractive to hummingbirds, and interestingly, many red flowers are tubular in shape, which makes it easy for hummingbirds to stick their long beaks in to sip nectar. Some flowers take on the shape of the insect itself, so that the pollinating insect thinks that it has found a sexual partner, and it tries to mate with this insect until it realizes its mistake. Well, what else? Nectar is the ultimate reward for a bird or an insect as it goes foraging among the flowers. That's what the evolutionist Charles Darwin said. Insects pollinate, and their reward is nectar. However, there are plants that appear attractive and smell good but have no nectar, and yet insects still pollinate these plants. One example is the green-winged orchid, which is purple and very attractive to bees. Well, why would bees pollinate a flower that has no nectar? The explanation lies in the objective of the plant. And to understand this objective a bit more, we need to know something about the pollination process. Okay, flowers have a male and a female part. These are called stamen and pistil, respectively. The anther in the stamen is where the sticky pollen is produced, and the stigma is the sticky part of the pistil that traps the pollen. So self-pollination can take place when the pollen of a flower's anther is distributed in the flower's stigma. This usually occurs when an insect becomes covered with pollen and rubs itself on the flower for a time before flying away. Cross-pollination, on the other hand, takes place when the pollen from one anther pollinates the stigma of another flower. Whether it's self-pollination or cross-pollination, pollination is the objective. Now let's go back to that green-winged orchid. Why doesn't this orchid produce nectar if pollination is the objective? Well, like other flowers, the green-winged orchid uses color and smell to trick an insect into pollinating. You might be thinking, wouldn't bees learn from experience that these orchids don't have nectar and avoid them? Well, each of these orchids produces a different odor. This is why bees go from orchid to orchid, believing that they're approaching flower with nectar. They have no idea it's the same type of flower. Very deceptive of the plant, isn't it? Well, here's why. A green-winged orchid deliberately attracts bees to prevent self-pollination from occurring. And it does this with its scent. See, if it had nectar, the bee would stick around and the result would be self-pollination. The pollen gets distributed onto the stigma of the orchid, right? But that's not what the orchid wants. It doesn't want self-pollination to take place. It sounds almost crazy, doesn't it? Well, what's wrong with self-pollination? Isn't it just as good as cross-pollination? Well, self-pollination might seem more efficient and a better way to propagate this species, but that's not true. Cross-pollination ensures the survival of the species because it results in greater genetic diversity. How? Well, when you've got two parents, the traits inherited from these parents can result in offspring that are much more varied. Obviously, an offspring from a single parent can carry the genes of only that one parent. And what's the advantage of having varied traits from two separate sets of genes? Well, the great variety in traits ensures a stronger chance of survival if there is an environmental change. Habitat destruction or an invasive plant species, for example. Plants with stronger traits will usually be able to weather such changes. On the other hand, if you have plants that possess genes from just a single parent, and the traits inherited happen to be weak, these plants stand a good chance of dying should some change occur in their surroundings. And this is why it's not surprising that some plants have developed a mechanism that prevents self-pollination and ensures cross-pollination.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you answer. 6. What is the main topic of the lecture? Seven. According to the lecture, what is a characteristic of bees as pollinators? Eight. In the lecture, the professor describes the ways in which a flower attracts a pollinator. Indicate whether each of the following is one such method. Nine. Why does the professor mention Charles Darwin? Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
See, if it had nectar, the bee would stick around and the result would be self-pollination. The pollen gets distributed onto the stigma of the orchid, right? But that's not what the orchid wants. It doesn't want self-pollination to take place. It sounds almost crazy, doesn't it? Well, what's wrong with self-pollination?
10. What does the professor mean when she says this?
It sounds almost crazy, doesn't it?
(11) Why is cross-pollination more effective than self-pollination?
Test 2, Part 2, Passage 3. Listen to part of a talk in an art history class. Okay, I would like to continue our discussion of public monuments. We've spent a lot of time going over some of the structures used to commemorate abstract concepts. I don't really want to get into this again, but, you know, like the Arc de Triomphe in Paris or the Statue of Liberty in New York. Anyway, these types of monuments are the most famous, and they're usually the most impressive as well. I mean, just look at the Statue of Liberty. It's easily one of the most recognizable symbols in the U.S., in the world even. That being said, most public monuments are on a lesser scale. Don't get me wrong, they are still important, and are actually really inspiring in their own way. They're just designed to convey a more personal feel. This is particularly true of statues of famous people. I don't just mean private works made to appease the vanity of a wealthy individual, but, you know, pieces commissioned by a country or large group to remember, usually a person who has made important contributions to humanity. The interesting thing is often these people, and by extension their statues, take on symbolic meaning that has little to do with the real person. I mean, think about Lenin. In the old Soviet Union, every city had at least one statue of Lenin. He was basically a symbol of the state, and the statues were political symbols. This happened in the United States when it came to portraying a certain historical figure. Can you guess who I'm talking about here? Well, if you guessed George Washington, you were right. At the end of the Revolution, many viewed him as the living embodiment of the new country. So when Congress decided to erect statues in his honor, let's just say there was considerable debate about the form they should take. Today, I would like to compare the approaches of two separate artists who were commissioned for this task and the reactions of the public to their finished works. Okay, what comes to your mind when you think about George Washington?
The first president, I guess.
Okay, what else?
The father of democracy? Also a great general. I mean, he led the American armies in the war, right?
Well, these are all good. In fact, it was the need to balance all these different aspects of Washington, you know, as a symbol that caused so many problems for the artists. Now, Horatio Greenoff was one of the artists selected to create a memorial to Washington, and he was very influenced by the classical style. In particular, he was fascinated with the works of the ancient Greek sculptors, and he was part of the European neoclassical art movement. These artists tried to portray modern events or people, pretty much everything, using classical themes and styles. Anyway, after receiving the commission in 1832, along with a budget of $5,000, remember, this was a lot of money at the time, Greenoff went to work. 9 years later, he unveiled his sculpture. The public's reception was, well, let's just say mixed. The statue was definitely large and impressive, but it was a bit too impressive. Greenoff had decided to portray Washington as the Greek god Zeus. Well, look at this picture. You can see that he has an idealized physique. I mean, the body. Washington didn't have such a muscular body in real life, especially not in his middle age. The fact that his torso was bare and he was wearing only a toga and sandals was also considered scandalous. Greenoff defended his decision by claiming that the use of contemporary clothing would distract from the sense of timelessness he was trying to create. Perhaps the most serious criticism was that it somehow conveyed the idea that Washington was an emperor. It emphasized his authority and made him appear grander than a normal man. Considering that Washington was so strongly associated with democracy and the fight against a tyrannical monarch, many felt this wasn't the best way to remember him. The statue ended up being placed in a woodshed behind the Library of Congress and became somewhat of a joke among those who had seen it. Now, an earlier statue commissioned by the state of Virginia, the birthplace of Washington, received a much better reception. In fact, it has come to be viewed as the iconic representation of our first president. This time the artist was Jean-Antoine Houdon, a French artist widely held to be the best sculptor of his generation. This may be a bit of an exaggeration, but anyway, like Greenoff, Houdon received $5,000 to cover expenses, and he was even brought across the Atlantic on the personal invitation of Benjamin Franklin to take some models of George Washington at his Mount Vernon estate. Houdon also sought inspiration from the classical world, choosing to model Washington after Cincinnatus, a famous Roman general who returned to the life of a simple farmer when the war was complete. However, Houdon dressed Washington in contemporary clothes, the uniform he wore during the Revolutionary War. He also emphasized aspects of Washington's private life by including a civilian walking stick and a plowshare. These were associated with people who had large farms in the country, rather than the normal accoutrements of power. This went over very well. By focusing on human qualities of Washington, Houdon was suggesting that all Americans had the potential to do great things. In effect, the statue allowed everyone to take part in Washington's successes. As I am sure you can imagine, this fits with the American view of life. Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you answer. 12. What does the professor mainly discuss? 13. Why does the professor mention the statues of Lenin? 'Listen again to a part of the lecture, then answer the question. Anyway, after receiving the commission in 1832, along with a budget of $5,000, remember this was a lot of money at the time, Greenoff went to work. 14. What does the professor mean when he says this? Remember, this was a lot of money at the time. "15. What are two characteristics of Greenoff's sculpture of Washington? Listen again to a part of the lecture, then answer the question. Now, an earlier statue commissioned by the state of Virginia, the birthplace of Washington, received a much better reception. In fact, it has come to be viewed as the iconic representation of our first president. This time the artist was Jean-Antoine Houdon, a French artist widely held to be the best sculptor of his generation. This may be a bit of an exaggeration, but anyway. 16. Why does the professor say this? This may be a bit of an exaggeration, but anyway. 17. What can be inferred about Washington?